My name is Richard Baer. I'm the Assistant District Manager for the District Government. I want to welcome you to the District Stormwater Workshop. On behalf of all the staff that have put this together, we appreciate your interest in this important topic. Stormwater is relevant in the villages for a variety of reasons, namely environmental stewardship, its interrelationship with potable water, NPDES permitting, and its relationship to the aesthetic standards within the villages. We are fortunate that much forethought was put into this resource during the development of this community. Stormwater was seen as a valuable commodity and was treated as such. Although we could spend months on this topic of stormwater itself, we respect your time and therefore must limit our discussion to the topic of stormwater resources, uses and system design. And after all, the villages repurposes about 6.5 million gallons of stormwater per day for irrigation, fire suppression, and other needs. This session, which offers the attendees a better understanding of our stormwater system, includes the same material as our Friday session. The session will be recorded for future viewing via our districtgov.org website, along with transcribed questions and answers from the Q&A sessions. And we ask that you hold your questions until the Q&A session afterward. I ask that district staff and our consultant engineers and infrastructure professionals stand now and be recognized. That means stand up. Stand up. Thank you. These people and many more contributed to this session today. They will lead our Q&A session immediately, and after the session, they will take your questions and answers and we will transcribe them. I would now ask any of our elected board officials to stand up and be recognized. Thank you. With that, I will introduce Trey Arnett, Principal of Arnett Environmental. Mr. Arnett is a Florida registered engineer and has 30 years of stormwater permitting, design, and engineering experience within the village's community. Let's lower the lights and the floor is yours, Trey.
Thank you, Richard. As Richard mentioned, we're so glad for your interest in this topic. This is something we live and breathe every day, and a lot of complexity. Like Richard mentioned, I've been involved in the villages about 21 years, so quite a while. It's been a privilege to be a part of the community. We do hope you find this to be very helpful, very beneficial to you, just both from an information and education standpoint, and then pass this along to your friends and neighbors who may have questions. We're going to hit 5 main topics as we go through the presentation today. Feedback. I'm not going to go through the details right now, but basically what we want you to go away with is a few key takeaways. The first thing I think is probably the most important is that you leave with the mindset of the same level of excellence that you see in the other things in the community. For example, the recreation facilities, the way we handle transportation, the same level of innovation, attention to detail and excellence goes into our stormwater management system as well. Another thing you're going to see is that it's a very highly complex system. We may think of it in a very basic way from what we see, but a lot goes into the design and permitting, management and operation of the system. So with that, we'll get into it. First, we're going to talk about stormwater permitting and how the system functions. One of the things that's important to understand at the outset is most of the systems within the villages are what's called a closed basin drainage system. And essentially what that means is there's no off-site discharge. We don't have, in most circumstances, any rivers or large lakes or the ocean that are taking the excess runoff. There's a few spots like around Lake Myoner or Lake Deaton, but the majority of our stormwater management within the community is closed basin. So we have to deal with everything within that basin itself. An important distinction for that is that anything that happens within the watershed will affect the water that is collected and has to be stored. One of the things that we need to be cognizant of, aware of, is changes in the characteristics of the basin can have an impact on the storage. So if a significant change is desired in the property, it can increase the amount of runoff, and so you may not have adequate storage. So you have to always be sure that the storage remaining in the system is adequate so that we can deal with the flood waters that might occur. In terms of collecting the runoff, that's considered the conveyance system. That's the system that pulls the water from your property off of the streets, goes into the inlets and the pipes that convey water to the retention systems. The way those are designed, we look at what's called a 25-year storm. And for this area of Sumter County, that's about 7 inches of rainfall in 24 hours. So we look at that amount of rainfall, how much runoff that generates, and the pipes and the inlets are sized to be able to take that water, off of the streets, off of the properties, and to convey it to the retention basins. If we were to get a storm that was higher than that, a larger storm, then things are going to back up a little bit. The water will remain in the streets. And we're going to talk about Hurricane Irma in a few minutes, but that was obviously a much more significant type of rainfall event. So things happened in that circumstance that were a bit different. The historic part of the villages in Lake County was designed and constructed back before the Water Management District even had standards for conveyance systems. So the belief is that those systems were designed for about a 10-year storm. Because there weren't standards, that was the practice of that day. So those older systems can behave a little bit differently because it wasn't that there was anything wrong. It was just, back in the 70s, and so the way things were designed were just different. Moving on to storage, the primary purpose of the storage is to protect properties from flooding. And so the way that those are designed is the engineering team will look at what's called a 100-year storm. That's a storm that has a 1% chance of occurring. So you could feasibly have multiple 100-year events in any given year. It's unlikely, but what that is a storm that has about 10 inches of rain in about a 24-hour period. Now, if you look at the St. John side, that's Lake County and also up in Marion County, it's a little bit different storm. It's a 25-year, 96-hour storm, and that's about 11 inches. So those are the amounts of rainfall that are considered when the basins are sized, so that if we have that kind of event occur, the retention basins will be able to store that water and not have any kind of flood impact on the properties within the community. One of the things that does happen, that was a design intent, if the developer and the districts were to have built what I'd call primary storage, those basins that you see that look like the water retention system. If all of the storage was to occur in just those basins, they would have had to have been much, much larger. And so it would have completely changed the economics and the way that things were built and designed. So by intent, the golf courses were designed to be the areas that received the highest flood water to be stored in them. So a more typical storm, you have a few inches of rainfall. That's all going to be retained within what you might call the primary basin. But if we have like a Hurricane Irma, it's going to overtop those primary basins and flood out into the golf courses. And that's the way it was intended, to be able to kind of maximize the use and benefit of that property. Now, talking specifically about Hurricane Irma for a few minutes, that event, we're not exactly sure. The rainfall came so quickly and so intensely that the measurement of the storm was not very exact. But the belief is it was about 12 to 15 inches of rain in about 18 hours. So if you look at the design storm being 10 inches in 24 hours, This was a much more significant event. It significantly exceeded the design for those systems. And that happened on the heels of a very, very wet summer. We had about 30 inches of rain from June through August, which is about 50% more than normal. So all of those factors kind of compounding together really presented what was an unprecedented situation. I've been here 21 years. We've never seen that kind of a circumstance occur. Both of those things occurring back to back. So with all that, if you look around the community, if you were able to get out and see what occurred, the stormwater management system really functioned incredibly well. There were no widespread flooding. You know, you saw some areas around the state where there was significant flooding that occurred on properties. As far as the district is aware, no water got inside the primary part of anyone's home. There may have been some water right up next to someone's porch, but given the circumstances that occurred, it was really a very successful experience. The system functioned much, much better than really it was even designed to do. So we were very, very grateful for that. The next couple of slides just show some pictures of what happened, right? Basins were overfilled, right? They had overtopped the bank. And so that impacted plant material. One of the things as we've talked to the district is we're going to have to consider, you know, when things are relocated, where's it going to be appropriate to replant materials? You know, where's a proper place to replant as we deal with some of the materials that were damaged, you know, through that event. It may impact the type of materials that are replanted in those areas. And one of the things is kind of a side note, we're going to talk about water use permitting in just a minute, but when you're dealing with permit compliance, from a water management perspective, the conditions of your water use can affect what you're able to do. And so if you think about the time frame before June of last year, it had been extremely dry, right? All through 2016 and through the early part of 2017, it was extremely dry. And so we were going into this with the water use at a very, very high level, much more than normal. And so all of those things affect what you're able to do, how you're able to respond to the needs of replanting. And so as the district works through that, they have to take all that into consideration. Where's the appropriate place? What are the water use conditions? So what decisions can be made to move forward in a way that, you know, reflects what the community wants to look like, right? The next slide shows you some golf courses. Like I mentioned, the golf courses are intended to flood when we have that, you know, large, severe type of event. It did what it was designed to do. Now, it was certainly more extreme than was planned for, but again, the system really functioned very, very well. And then finally, we had a few areas where the water actually backed up out of some inlets in our streets and, you know, impacted some roadways. That happened in Village of Hillsborough and Fernandina in Districts 9 and 10 in a small area. It happened in District 4 in the Village of Chatham, and as well in the Hickory Hill Hammock area in District 1. So just a few areas, but essentially that severe of a storm, we did have some areas that backed up. But I wanted to show you, because there were some questions that came out about that. This is just kind of a theoretical example. If you look at the top of bank for this theoretical example, we're showing at 80, elevation of 80. And so we're assuming we get a very extreme event and the flood comes up to an elevation of 86. This blue line represents where the water would be under that severe type of example. And what's important to see is the way everything's designed around the community is if you were in that circumstance, which in some areas of the villages we were after Hurricane Irma, what's going to happen is the water will back up, it'll come out of the inlets in the streets, and the streets, the golf courses, and your yards are going to be impacted by the floodwater long before your home. All of the finished floors of the homes are set well above those street elevations, and so there's a lot of area for the floodwater to spread out. but there was definitely some concern about what would have happened or what could have happened. The second area we want to cover is talking about stormwater as an alternative supply. When you're building a community like the Villages, one of the things that's very true from a permitting standpoint is what we're doing, the way things are designed and built, can't adversely affect the environment. So when it comes to our springs and wetlands and the things around Florida that make it a beautiful place, our water use can't negatively impact those things. And so from a water standpoint, the water use permit sets the quantity of water that we're allowed to withdraw from the ground, from wells, and then use it for whatever water use purposes there are. The permitting requirements force you to use the lowest quality of water that's available first. And so the kind of hierarchy of use is stormwater, being the lowest quality, is the first primary water source that is used in the community. And then moving kind of up the chain is reclaimed water or reclaimed wastewater. And then finally, when those sources aren't available, groundwater is used. And again, what we're doing, the water use can't have an adverse impact on the environment. So when all this was being designed and planned and the basins were being looked at, considering what can be done to maximize the use of that alternative supply was a huge consideration. When we built the utilities south of 466, and even to some degree, we're going to go over that in a second, to some degree north of 466, we looked at ways to maximize that alternative supply. We use stormwater as our primary source of irrigation, as well as a fire protection source. And it helps us reduce the demand of groundwater, which again, the whole point is to be wise environmental stewards and to be able to build a community like the Villages and not have those adverse impacts. This is a few pictures that show you what do things look like north of 466. What is our stormwater reuse system like in that area? We use stormwater as an irrigation source north of 466 for primarily golf courses and roadways. There is not a separate non-potable irrigation system that supplies residential and commercial uses, but the design did consider how do we incorporate stormwater use in those golf course and roadway type systems like Buena Vista Boulevard and El Camino. And so stormwater is collected in all those line retention basins. We use stormwater, reclaimed water, and groundwater, again, sort of in the hierarchy of use. And then there are separate irrigation pumping stations that will deliver that water out to whatever the particular use is. From a residential and commercial standpoint, all of the irrigation is from the potable water supply. So if you live north of 466, the irrigation on your lawn is the same as the drinking water. But on some of the separate areas like our golf courses is a different supply that is utilizing stormwater. Now one of the questions you might ask is, why is it different? Those areas, as you move from the oldest parts of Lake County, into districts 2, 3, and 4, and then eventually south of 466, just like everything in our lives, as you move through time, you have innovations, you have things you understand better, and just the way that the design and the engineering was accomplished, things were learned, systems were developed, and the system just got better and better as we move through. Recently on the transportation side, if you recall, some of the paths north of 466 were narrower, right? They were built differently. So we've gone back and made some enhancements to those to take some of the things that have been learned. Now from a stormwater standpoint, to go back and install the type of system we have south of 466 would be extremely cost prohibitive. But just important to understand, the innovations kind of happened over time. So there's a significant shift in the way things are managed north and south of 466, with respect to stormwater. So the next couple slides are talking about stormwater reuse south of 466. We have a separate non-potable irrigation system that supplies irrigation water for everything residential and commercial. The only use that is not covered by this system are our golf courses, okay? And so to your home, you'll have a separate irrigation meter that brings non-potable irrigation water. The sources are going to be stormwater as our primary source, and then when we don't have adequate stormwater, we supplement it with lower fluoride groundwater. And the treatment that's involved, we filter the water coming out of the basins. We'll add a little bit of chlorine to help control, bacteriological growth, but we're not trying to treat the water to where you can drink it. We're just trying to treat it to where it's able to be used for irrigation. So it's a different type of approach. One of the questions that has come up a number of times is, why does the irrigation water sometimes smell? And the lower fluoride groundwater, the water's been in the ground a much longer time, has picked up some additional things in it that you don't see in the upper fluoride. And one of the things that is the primary odor contributor is hydrogen sulfide. And so when we're at a time of the year where the irrigation demands are relatively high and we don't have much stormwater, the water is pumped out of the ground, contains hydrogen sulfide, and then it's pumped very quickly into your irrigation systems. And so as the water sprays out of your irrigation heads, you'll smell that rotten egg smell, what hydrogen sulfide smells like. So that's more than likely what you're experiencing when you have that odor coming out of your irrigation system. One thing I would point out, we've had questions over the years of, what should I do if I want to irrigate some vegetables, if you plant a little vegetable garden? Because the irrigation system is non-potable water, the recommendation is always to use the potable system. So if you're going to plant a little garden, use the hose bibs on the side of your house. That is drinking water. The non-potable irrigation water is only connected directly to your irrigation system. So that's just kind of a little thing we'd like to make sure you understand. And then kind of the third big point, the question we get a lot is, why are there times when the irrigation systems are running around the community while it's raining? If you remember, coming through Hurricane Irma, all of the basins were very, very full, right? Because we have this extensive stormwater reuse system, we also can use that system to help us recover when the waters are very high. And so there will be certain times of the year, certain years, where decisions are made to say, we need to dispose of excess stormwater. So when that happens, some of the roadways, some golf course areas that are interconnected, we'll have them turn on and basically run 24/7 disposing of excess stormwater. So when you see that occurring, more than likely that's what's going on. The next slide kind of shows you, once we pull the water out of the retention basins, it essentially functions just like a normal water distribution system, running out up and down the streets and coming to your home or any commercial property. A third area I'm going to talk about are just, what are all the types of basins around the community? We'll frequently get questions that say, why does the basin here look different than it does over here? So we spent some time and looked through all of the villages to do our best to come up with how many different types of stormwater retention systems do we have out there. And I'm not going to talk through them all, but there's 14 different ones that we were able to identify. And each one of those will have different characteristics, will function differently depending on what's happening. And so, again, the point is there's many different types of scenarios. And each of those specifics will impact how it functions, how it responds to storms, what it might look like, when it is or isn't raining. When we have the breakout sessions after this main presentation, there's a series of maps that show all of the community, and you'll be able to look and ask questions. If you have a specific question about the basin near your home, you can look and see and ask some questions. Well, why does this function this way? This map is just a portion of the District 5 area in the north of Lake Miona. And just on this one little segment of the villages, there are 8 different types of basins represented. So if you can see this, all the different elements on the map, and this is what you're going to see in the room next door when we have the breakout sessions, is the whole community kind of broken down like this. Up here in the top left, these dark blue basins, that's a type that is more what you might consider a traditional basin, where the water that comes into it or goes out of it is all related to rainfall. On the map, you'll see the dashed lines kind of represent basin connections that are behind some type of control structure. And then the solid lines represent direct connections. And then each color of the type of basin will show you what type it is. So as you're looking at the maps in the next room, you'll be able to kind of get an idea of what you're looking at. One of the comments that we'll get occasionally is, can you take water from here and move it way over here? And while there are some capabilities to move water around, which generally occurs within the basins that are connected to a pump station, there's not an ability to move water, for example, from the basin systems north of 466, south of 466, or from District 5 down to District 7. So within a particular area, some water movement occurs, but there's not long distance, broad transfer of water. The hydraulics just don't allow us to be able to do that. That's a common misconception that we'll get from questions that come up. The next slide shows 3 specific types, and again, there was 14, so we're not going to go through them all. But I wanted to just walk through with you a few types so you can get an idea of the kinds of differences that can occur. So this type 1, a basin system that supplies a VWCA or SWCA or FWCA, all these Water Conservation Authority acronyms. Back on this map, it's all kind of the turquoise blue colored basins you see. So if you're living near or you're seeing that type of system, there's often many interconnected systems, many basins that are interconnected with it. The sources of water are stormwater runoff and then lower Floridan groundwater. So what will happen just from an operational standpoint on those, because that's our irrigation and fire protection system, right? The water always has to be available. You can't get in a situation where you can't fight a fire and you can't supply irrigation water. And so as the excess stormwater is being used down to a certain level, then once you've exhausted that available stormwater, every day groundwater is being added. So if you live near or you're looking at one of those type of systems, they'll tend to have a low management level where the basin doesn't really go far below that. Every day we're adding water. The second category, what I call the golf course basin type, on this map, that's the ones you see that are in kind of bright yellow. There's a couple on the map. With those, the basins are isolated. No stormwater is being collected and conveyed to those basins. Now what falls directly in them, it'll get some stormwater just from what falls in, but we don't deliver any runoff to those systems. So if you live on one of those, and those are the irrigation sources for a golf course, we're going to pump reclaimed water into them, and they're also going to have groundwater as a backup when reclaimed water supplies aren't enough. So if it's wintertime and irrigation demands are fairly low on the golf course, most of the residents are here, so our reclaimed water supplies are the highest. The levels in those basins tend to stage up and kind of stay high. And so, but if it moves into the spring, the irrigation demand on the golf courses is much higher, our reclaimed water supplies are lower, and those systems are going to fluctuate fairly dramatically every day. So it's just going to behave a little bit different. And then the third type we have highlighted at the bottom, the type 5 is what I was pointing out before, the dark blue color in your upper left. That's what I'd call a more traditional type of stormwater basin. So those systems are really just responding to rainfall. So if it rains, the basin levels will come up. If it's dry, through evaporation and infiltration, the levels are going to drop. There's no active management of water in or out. And so they're really just going to respond directly to how rainfall affects them. There's a couple slides here to give you a sort of a cross-section of what things look like north and south of 466. To the north, if you look at a typical basin, this isn't every one, but a typical basin north of 466 is going to have a depth of maybe 5 to 7 feet where it's been lined with either a clay liner or some type of membrane liner. to help manage an aesthetic level. And then above the liner is where the floodwaters are stored. So again, from earlier part of the discussion, if we have a 100-year flood event, all of that flood storage occurs above the lined area of those systems. If you move south of 466, remember there's a shift in the way we were looking at stormwater management, and we have the separate irrigation system, the separate non-potable system that relies heavily on the use of stormwater. So what was done in the design and construction of these is some extra liner was added. There's a normal depth of water, maybe 5 to 6 feet for aesthetic purposes, and then another 2 feet of liner was added above that to be able to collect and store and use excess stormwater to help, again, offset groundwater demand for the environmental benefits of that. Now what happens if the level of the basin is above, you see on the slide where it shows ML, that's management level. When it's above 58, it's just available excess stormwater that we're using. So no water is being added in. But if you're down at 58, to where all of the excess stormwater has been used up, that's the point where we start adding groundwater in each day to help recover the amount that might have been used for irrigation purposes. All right, the fourth area we're going to talk about briefly is stormwater operation. How do we operate and manage stormwater? It's a very, very complex system. This is just a little snapshot of an area. I believe it's in District 6. And there's many different considerations that go in. As you look on the map, you see there's some like orange lines connecting basins. Those are representative of the gravity connections between systems that are all at the same level. But then we have other areas where we have transfer pumps, the label in the bottom right. When you have a stormwater retention system that is at a lower elevation, the only way to move excess stormwater from that system to the system where the pump stations are located is to pump it. So some systems will have these transfer pumps on them. And then other systems will be at higher elevations. You can't directly connect them, right? What would happen if they were directly connected? All the water is going to run downhill. And so you'd empty one set of system and you'd overfill the downhill system. And so there are controlled valves between those. And so if you have a circumstance where there's water stored that's in excess of that management level, we have stormwater available to use, and the downhill or the downstream system has available storage, then the operations folks can go out, open those valves, and move the water downhill. Again, the point is always what can be done to maximize the use of that available resource, that alternative water supply. Decisions always have to be driven primarily by our water use permit requirements. So if we have certain amounts of water that we're allowed to use for whatever the purposes are, we have to maximize the use of stormwater first, and then after that we're able to use the groundwater to make up for those needs. Now whenever possible, we do look at aesthetics. So decisions are made by the operations folks to say, you know, is the water needed right now, or can it be timed differently? But ultimately, water management and permit constraints drive all those water management decisions. One of the things that happens to us when you have a more severe event, like Hurricane Irma, the villages didn't know for sure that we were going to be impacted by that hurricane until just a very few days out, right? There were some predictions that might have been coming this way, maybe a week and a half or so out, but even up to the last day or two, was it going to turn and go up the east side of Florida? Was it going to stay out into the west? And so all of those considerations have to go into how we manage those available resources. If decisions were made to, you know, pump everything out and then the hurricane didn't come, then we'd be in a situation where we had no resources left. So all those things have to be considered. And so you take the best available information, You use the experience that has been gathered over the years, and you try to make your best decision on how to manage those resources in a way that will benefit the community. The next picture shows you there's many interconnected systems, and this is, again, a question that comes up. The reason the systems are interconnected is to allow us to capture and use more of the available stormwater. And those connections are by gravity pipes between a lot of the systems. And this next slide shows you what that might look like. And we wanted to just talk through briefly on how those interconnected pipes can have an impact on things, right? If you're looking at this, you know, these two basins, Basin A and B, are directly connected systems by underground gravity pipes, but depending on the elevation of those pipes between those systems can impact how it functions. So if the water level is above, if you look in the middle of that, there's a high point in the gravity connection system of 57.2. So if the water level is above 57.2, those two basins are going to function exactly the same. They're going to rise and fall together. But if it's a dry time of the year where you know, it's May and the levels in those basins have fallen down below 57.2, they're going to disconnect and each basin is going to act independently. So depending on how they're connected, what elevation the pipes are at that are connecting the two, can all impact how they function on any given, you know, set of circumstances. And then the last area we're going to talk about briefly is stormwater basin maintenance. There's three areas we're going to cover. First, with respect to water quality. When it comes to the stormwater retention basins, water quality is the responsibility of the district property management folks. So they're the ones that go out and will you know, treat nuisance plants or have them removed or deal with algae. There's some constraints when you're dealing with chemicals and putting them in a surface water body. There's only certain things that can be done. So the district property management folks are looking at how do we best manage the water quality, both from an aesthetic standpoint and from the ability to use that for irrigation. Now when you move outside of the water and you look at the banks around the stormwater retention basins, the way that those are maintained is typically determined by who owns the property. So if it's adjacent to a golf course or if it's within one of the numbered districts, that will direct who's handling the landscaping, who's handling the turf maintenance, who's handling cleanup of any kind of debris that might be accumulated on the bank, you know, removal of trash. And then finally, NPDES, a long acronym, but basically what that is a federal program that requires proper management of the stormwater quality. So we're not allowed, it's against the law to dump things into the stormwater system that are not rain. So there are, all of the district personnel have information and they're informed to kind of keep an eye out for that, you know, to have nothing other than rain, you know, make it down those drains. Because anything that goes into the retention collection system eventually makes its way to those ponds and can affect, you know, the fish that are in there, the birds that might be feeding on those basins. And so protecting the water quality is a very important element of the maintenance of that basin. The next slide just shows you a couple examples. This is again in District 5. Some of the basins that are on the Palmer Golf Course, the water quality is maintained by Sumter Landing Project wide, but the basins around them, the areas around the basins are maintained by Golf Management Solutions. And then over to the left, the areas that are within the district are maintained by Sumter Landing Project wide. The water quality, as well as through the agreements of all the districts, all the numbered districts, the areas surrounding the basins are maintained by the project-wide group as well. And so just to kind of wrap it up, from a permitting and function standpoint, the important things to kind of take away are the idea of closed basin drainage and how that affects the way the systems work. The fact that by and large, the systems are designed for a 100-year storm, but in some areas, some of the older parts of the community, those permitting guidelines weren't in place. So that affects how things function. And then finally, the idea that the golf courses were designed to to flood. In the event of those extreme storms that can come, the golf courses are supposed to do what they did. From an alternative water supply standpoint, the goal is to minimize the use of groundwater because it helps protect all those environmental resources. It allows for the development and operation of a community of this size without having any adverse effect on things like Lake Miona, Lake Deaton, Fenny Spring. All of those things are being protected through the way these alternative water supplies are being used. With respect to types of basins, many different types. So we'd encourage you in the breakout sessions to just ask some questions if you have them. Things shifted north and south of 466. We went from a system to the north where we recover stormwater, we use it to the extent we can on golf courses and some roadways, to south of 466, a completely separate stormwater reuse system that goes to every home and every commercial property. So a big shift in the way those basins function. From a system operation standpoint, very complex. A lot of decisions have to go in. And we don't live in a perfect world, right? So things can happen that you can't predict. And so the staff does the very best job they can to try to manage those aesthetic concerns while complying with permit constraints and all of the regulatory things that affect this community. And then finally, from a basin maintenance standpoint, water quality, district property management. If you see some issues with respect to algae, they're the folks to contact about that. And then maintenance of the banks around is typically handled by the property owner, whoever that might be.